Thanks everybody for coming. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. James Robinson, a university professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at University of Chicago. Prior to his work in Chicago, he was a professor of government at Harvard University. He's a distinguished scholar of comparative economics and political development with a focus on the long run. His book, Why Nations Fail, is a summary of nearly 20 years of academic research and publications. Its central theme is that the economic fate of nations is determined by their institutions. Today, when you look around the world, there are enormous differences in income per capita, development outcomes, life expectancy, education, and other measures of human development. Professor Robinson proposes a framework for understanding these differences. And importantly, this framework is also used to examine patterns of development to better understand the historical context of today's inequality. So please welcome me in joining Professor James Robinson.
All right. Okay, thanks very much. So I'm going to give a half-hour version of the book, Why Nations Fail, and then I think people can ask questions and things like that. So, there's lots of different ways of talking about this, or sort of introducing the argument in the book. And in the book, the first chapter is about sort of the long-run history of North America and South America, and why North America ended up so different from South America. But that takes a bit of time to get into, to do justice to it. So I find in a short talk, the easiest way to explain sort of everything that the book is about is, to look at this photograph of the Korean peninsula at night. And you can see, quite a few things about this, because South Korea, there's lots of electricity and light bulbs, and it's very bright. And North Korea, is very dark. You can see a little sort of spot of light there in Pyongyang. It's probably the presidential compound in Pyongyang. The previous president used to have a big wave machine, so you probably need a lot of electricity to drive a wave machine, and light bulbs to light you while you're surfing or whatever. So anyway, so you can see that there's a lot of electricity and light in South Korea and not very much in North Korea. And this is a sort of very interesting proxy for economic success. Most unsuccessful countries in the world economically, if you look at them at night, sub-Saharan Africa, they're very black. There's a lot of electricity and light bulbs in South Korea. So South Korea has the level of prosperity income per capita of a sub-Saharan Africa. North Korea has the level of income per capita prosperity of a sub-Saharan African country. South Korea is one of the most successful economies in the world in the last 40, 50 years. It's a member of the OECD. So what's the difference between an economically successful country like South Korea and an economically unsuccessful country like North Korea? So that's what the book is about. The book's called Why Nations Fail, but fail is a sort of ambiguous word. But it's really about comparative economic development and trying to propose a simple way of thinking about these differences. And you could be sitting there thinking, well, we know the difference between North Korea and South Korea. North Korea is a communist country and South Korea is a capitalist country, but that's not the generalization we make in the book, and I don't think it's a very useful generalization, actually. A country like North Korea, though it might be avowedly communist, actually has a lot in common with nearly every poor country that doesn't say it's communist or doesn't claim to be communist. So that's not going to be the distinction. Okay, so what is the difference between North Korea and South Korea? Well, South Korea has a lot of technology. Okay, so here, you can see it has electricity and light bulbs, not very new technology, but it has a lot of technology. And economists have known since the work of Robert Solow in the 1950s that what drives economic development over the long run is innovation. So I don't need to say that to people sitting in Google, I guess. It's all about innovation, about new technologies, raising living standards, raising productivity. So what Solow showed is that drove long-run economic development. And if you look around the world today and you say, what's the difference in some kind of accounting sense between poor countries and rich countries? It's that poor countries just don't use all of this technology that has such incredibly positive consequences for living standards and productivity, like they don't use electricity and light bulbs in North Korea. Okay, so why is that? It's not something mysterious. I mentioned light bulbs and electricity being around a long time. It's not that, Google just invented it and the North Koreans haven't kind of heard about it yet. So this has been around for a long, long time, but somehow they just don't use it. So why is that? Well, the book sort of provides a simple way of thinking about that. And, going back to innovation and technological change, what Robert Solow called total factor productivity, makes you ask, what drives these differences between North Korea and South Korea? And that's got something to do with the way the economy is organized. So yes, I said it's not about socialism and capitalism, but it is about the way these different countries are organized. What's interesting about the Korean case, of course, is that North Korea and South Korea were pretty similar 50, 60 years ago. So this divergence is not some deep, long-run historical thing. It's something that happened pretty recently. And the most obvious reason, I think, why it happened is that North Korea and South Korea got organized in very different ways. The economy got organized in very different ways. And in South Korea, a society emerged where there were incentives and opportunities for people who wanted to innovate, who wanted to create new technologies. And in North Korea, there were neither incentives nor opportunities for anyone who wanted to do anything like that. So I think the socialism captures some idea about opportunities and incentives, but the whole problem is much more is much different from that and much more general than communism versus capitalism. Okay, so big differences in economic development, big differences in the use of technology, big differences in people's incentives and opportunities. I'm going to come back also to the last layer of it, which is going to be, how come North Korea and South Korea got organized like that? How come in South Korea a society got organized which created incentives and opportunities for people to innovate and adopt technology, and North Korea didn't? And that's also obviously something to do with the politics of those societies. So in the book is about comparative economic development. It sort of says, there's these layers of trying to understand comparative economic development. There's the kind of economic layer, innovation, technological change, what induces that, what creates very different patterns of that in different countries. But then lying behind that is a sort of deeper question in some sense, which is, why is it that some societies got organized in a way that creates incentives and opportunities and other societies didn't or don't? So here's, maybe I shouldn't show who this gentleman is in Google, but I couldn't resist the temptation. Let me give you another example which does come up in the first book. So I talked about it in the first chapter. I talked about North Korea, South Korea. Let me give you another example we use, which has got us into a bit of trouble, which is the two richest men in the world. I know fortunes go up and down, but they're usually up there in the top 3 or 4. Bill Gates and Carlos Slim in Mexico. So what we get you to think about in the first chapter of the book is it's very telling to understand why the United States is more economically successful than Mexico, say, to think about how Carlos Slim and Bill Gates made their money. Bill Gates made his money by innovating. This picture is very significant. I'm going to come back to it in a second. Bill Gates made his money by innovating. Carlos Slim made his money with monopolies. Bill Gates, he made a fortune, but he also created a lot of wealth for other people. He created lots of positive externalities in the computer industry. So he created a lot more wealth than he himself was able to grab. Carlos Slim, according to the OECD, reduced GDP in Mexico by about 2% a year. So this is a very conservative kind of dead weight for the economists in the room. Dead weight losses of monopoly reduces Mexican GDP by about 2% a year. So he actually reduced GDP in Mexico, according to the OECD, by more than his own fortune. So it's not just a matter of taking wealth from Mexicans and giving it to him. It's actually reducing income in Mexico. So in the US, innovation, you make a lot of money. It has all these spillovers. In Mexico, the way to make money is not through innovation. The way to make money is to get monopolies, and that actually makes you very rich, but it actually reduces the prosperity of the society. So this is United States and Mexico, but I want you to think this is really what goes on in North Korea and South Korea. In both cases, you have economies, some of which are designed to create incentives and opportunities for innovation, but other ones where you have very different incentives, very different opportunities with very different consequences for the economy. Now, I said Carlos Slim was a monopolist and Bill Gates, was an innovator. But of course, this is not about, people. this is about systems. Bill Gates wanted to be a monopolist too. Everyone wants to be a monopolist. Professors want to be intellectual monopolists. Google, heaven forbid, they'd probably like to be a monopolist too if they could get away with it. But this is Bill Gates, giving evidence to the US antitrust authorities. This is, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So here politics starts seeping in as well. So it's not just that, there's incentives and opportunities in some places and not in other places, but there's a system, what we call institutions in social science. There's a system of institutions that creates and sustains those incentives and those opportunities. And that involves, in this case, the state. It involves the implementation of antitrust policy. And that's an old story in the US. This is a contemporary cartoon from the early in the last century of the octopus of the Standard Oil Company. So the Standard Oil Company was one of the big famous trusts, Rockefeller's trust. And here it is with its tentacles around Congress and the White House, and this was the robber barons, the first age of great monopolization in the U.S. economy in the late 19th century. And what was the consequence of the robber barons? The consequence was the origin of antitrust, and indeed, Standard Oil Company was broken up by U.S. antitrust, as was Bell, telephones, etc. subsequently. So there's an old history of fighting against monopolies in the US and sustaining an institutional environment which creates these incentives and opportunities. So in the book, I'm sort of painting a dichotomy here. The world's more complicated. There's lots of nuances and gray areas. But just for the sake of the argument, it's helpful to think of two different types of societies. Societies where somehow things get organized, institutions get organized in a way which creates these incentives and opportunities. That creates innovation, it creates prosperity. And there's other places where things work differently. Maybe it's Mexico, maybe it's North Korea, maybe it's the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where I do a lot of research. Part of the story with electricity, of course, is it's not just the private sector or innovation in the private sector, but the public sector has to be incentivized to provide basic public goods like roads. So this is what they call Interstate Number 1. This is one of the main highways in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The government doesn't bother providing any infrastructure. You can see what this is like. This is the dry season. You have to dig yourself out every kilometer or so. If it was the wet season, you wouldn't be going anywhere. So this is an even more dramatic failure in terms of provision of basic public goods and services than you'd find in North Korea. So we put some labels on these different kind of economic systems. We say, what is it that South Korea and the United States has in common with other prosperous places? It has these economic institutions, rules that incentivize people and create opportunities. And we call them inclusive. Okay, so we say, if you think about the economy, what's common in these places is that you have inclusive economic institutions. So why this word inclusive? So let me go back to the light bulb. Okay, so here's Edison's patent of the light bulb. Okay, so I have one thing in common with Thomas Edison. He had very bad hearing. He had very bad hearing as well. So that's probably the only thing I have in common with Thomas Edison. So Edison patented the light bulb in 1880. Okay, now patents are very interesting things. Patents very closely connected to incentivizing innovation. Patents have a long history. Patents were in the US Constitution. The first patent board met in 1790. It was so important that Thomas Jefferson was on it. So what was so important about the patents and giving out patents and stuff? Well, it was about creating incentives for innovation. Innovation creates positive externalities, so any person thinking about innovating is never going to benefit from all the wealth that they create because of these externalities. So the idea here was patents bring the private return to innovation closer to the social return. Now, what's particularly interesting about patents is if you study who took out patents in the US historically. Like, who was it who took out patents, And what's interesting about the social background of patentees is that they come from all over the social spectrum. So I don't know if people have an analysis of who works for Google, but economic historians did an analysis of 19th century patenting in the US. And what they showed was that who took out patents? Artisans, farmers, elites, non-elites, professional people, uneducated people. Thomas Edison hardly had any formal schooling. He was basically homeschooled by his mother. I'm not advocating, lack of schooling as a strategy for innovation, but I'm just saying talent, ideas, creativity, that's spread out very broadly in society. You don't know where that is. So you need to create a system which can harness all of that latent talent. And this was part of the system. And why the word inclusive? Well, because you need to include everybody in this. Patenting didn't matter who you were. You could take out a patent, you paid a fee, and the state enforced your patent. Okay? The government enforced your patent, like the government enforced antitrust. Okay? So this inspires this word inclusive in the research we do. But that's the economics of it. If you want to have innovation, you want to have prosperity, you need to have these inclusive economic institutions. What's the opposite of that? Well, extractive economic institutions. That's what they have in North Korea, or that's what they have in Mexico. You could say North Korea and Mexico, those places are really different, aren't they? Well, yeah, they are, but one thing we do in the book is to say, if you look at poor countries in the world today, they look terribly different. Uzbekistan, North Korea, Sierra Leone, Colombia. What do those places have in common? All the details look different, but this idea of kind of extractive institutions or inclusive institutions is supposed to say, yes, all these details look very different, but actually, from the economic point of view, they all have this consequence of blocking talent and creativity. Okay, but that's the economics of it. But what's more interesting, I think, and kind of more innovative, at least academically, is to say, okay, but you need to get beyond that. We need to ask, why was it that in the US they were so obsessed with setting up this patent system? Or why was it they created a state that was able to enforce antitrust and drag the richest man in the world into a court? Why was it that the US created such a political society or such a set of political institutions? So we emphasize, again, something which is sort of obvious from the Korean example, which is lying behind these different economic systems are different political systems somehow. So what creates inclusive economic institutions are inclusive political institutions, and what creates extractive economic institutions are extractive political institutions. So we emphasize two dimensions of political institutions, so both of which are sort of come up in, I was going to say the discussion, but it's not a discussion, it's more like a kind of pontification. So why was it, what does it take? I'm asking, what does it take to create an inclusive economy? What does it take to create, a patent system which is open to everybody on the same terms, with a state which can come along and enforce that system once it's set up? And we emphasize two dimensions of that. One, which is really something like state capacity, or we call it political centralization, which is that what happened in the United States was they created a state, a modern state, which was able to enforce rules. Okay? So this is a crucial part of having inclusive economic institutions. The problem in the Congo, for example, is the Congo doesn't have a state which is actually capable of raising resources or enforcing rules, or the state doesn't exist. The state is so corrupt and patrimonial and ineffective. So that's part of the story. The other thing we emphasize is that, political power has to be broadly distributed in society. So the reason that the patent system got set up the way it did in the United States is because the United States in 1790 wasn't the sort of modern democracy in the way political scientists would describe it, but it was a situation where political power was very broadly based in society, at least amongst adult males. So power was too broadly distributed to create some oligarchic patent system. So this is the two elements of inclusive political institutions. So when those things fail, when you either have a state, you lack a state, or political power is narrowly concentrated, that's a situation where we say you have extractive political institutions. Here's an example of extractive political institutions. It's a fun example. President Mugabe, who's been president of Zimbabwe since 1980. You might know he's a very successful politician. He's also a very lucky man. He won the lottery here, So that's impressive, He's president and he wins the lottery. So, so here's a situation with, where there's a very narrow concentration of political power. There's a lack of accountability. That's not a circumstance in which you're going to get inclusive economic institutions. So if you were going to put the whole kind of thesis in a matrix, but they wouldn't let us put this in the book. This was like too complicated. No, you can't put that in the book. But it's very useful when you give talks. Again, this dichotomy is very simplistic, and I'm happy to talk about nuance. But the idea is to sort of say, think about the matrix, then poor countries, where are poor countries? Poor countries are in this cell of the matrix here with extractive economic institutions underpinned by extractive political institutions. Economically successful countries are in the cell of the matrix where there's inclusive economic institutions that drives innovation, drives growth, but they have to be underpinned by inclusive political institutions, okay? So what about the off-diagonals? Well, what we say about the off-diagonals is that the off-diagonals are sort of unstable. You can't stay, we emphasize a lot the sort of stability, of extractive, and the stability of inclusive. There's lots of feedback loops that once you get an extractive society set up, it tends to persist over time. And once you get an inclusive society set up, that tends to persist over time as well. So, those states are pretty persistent. But the off-diagonals are sort of unstable. For example, think about a sort of transition from an extractive to a more inclusive society. South Africa. In 1994, South Africa moved to a much more inclusive political society. Black people got to vote instead of just white people, and Nelson Mandela was elected president. So that's like going from a situation where you had extractive political institutions to inclusive political institutions. Now, what did the economy in South Africa look like, before then? Well, there was something called apartheid. And apartheid was a massive system to benefit white people at the expense of Africans. Okay? There was a labor market in apartheid, and the labor market essentially massively discriminated against black people in favor of white people. Until the early 1980s, there was something called the color bar, and the color bar was a huge list of occupations that only white people could undertake, which black people couldn't undertake. Okay? But the point is, imagine you transition from extractive political institutions to inclusive political institutions like you did after 1994. You've got this extractive economy. Those two things can't coexist. You can't have an economy which is extractive and discriminates against black people when suddenly black people have political power. So then extractive economy crumbles, and then you move in that direction. It's a little bit more complicated than that in South Africa, but that's the idea. Okay, so what about the other off-diagonal? Well, you could think of China, for example. How does China fit into this theory? Well, in 1970s, China was here. It had extractive economic institutions. It had extractive political institutions. It was a poor, technologically backward place. Starting in 1978, they started moving economic institutions in a more inclusive direction. So the whole, the way you'd think about Chinese economic growth in the context of this theory would be Chinese economic growth is exactly induced by this movement towards more inclusive economic institutions. So the whole deregulation of agriculture, the household responsibility system, that was about creating incentives in agriculture. What was the consequence? Massive increase in agricultural productivity. Okay? That spreads to the industrial sector in the 1980s. But what does the theory say? The theory says the Chinese moved from having extractive to inclusive economic institutions. They didn't move the same way South Africa did. They moved in this direction. But they maintained their extractive political institutions. So we say, well, that can't happen. You can't have an inclusive economy underpinned by extractive political institutions. What we try to do in the book is to sort of give lots of historical examples to suggest that narrowly concentrated political power always ends up getting abused at the expense of the economy. So fundamentally underpinning things like the rule of law or something like a patent system which is open to everybody on the same terms, that's got to be underpinned by inclusive political institutions, otherwise it can't last. Okay, so that's the basic idea. And then we use this matrix, we don't have the matrix in the book, we use the matrix to just basically talk about, what does it take to transition from an extractive society to an inclusive society. So there's no one way of doing that. If you look at different cases, historically, different societies have kind of moved from extractive to inclusive in different ways. But I guess we do emphasize very much the politics of this, that this way of thinking suggests that poverty is really a political problem. It's not a kind of engineering, technical problem. It's not the problem in Congo, or North Korea. It's not that, people don't know that if they used all this wonderful technology, etc., they'd be much richer. It's that the way things are organized doesn't create incentives for people to use that technology or opportunities. There's no incentive to be a businessman. In North Korea, you can't be a businessman because businessmen are just not tolerated. In the Congo, you could be a businessman, but if you became a businessman, you might get predated on by the state or predated on by other people. The state doesn't provide any complementary inputs or public goods. Why is that? Well, the money gets stolen by the politicians, such as it is. So there's just many elements of extractive economic and political institutions, which mean if you're in the Congo, you just can't make money as a business person. There's just no way you can do it in that institutional environment. So how do you solve that problem? Our perspective is, sure, there are cases where somebody has come along and sort of said, like Deng Xiaoping, let's move the economy. Let's move the economy in this direction and stuff is going to happen. And there are examples of that. But what we try to argue in the book is that the more sort of enduring path to having a really consolidated, inclusive society and prosperous society is that political change precedes economic change. So the story in the British case, for example, historically in Britain, is very much like the story I gave in South Africa, which is that political institutions became much more inclusive, and that drove much more inclusion in the economic sphere. So if you were asking, how would I think about solving the economic problems of a poor country like Colombia or the Democratic Republic of Congo, I'd say you have to focus on the politics. You have to think about trying to make political institutions more inclusive. Of course, that's a difficult thing to do because there's a good reason why political institutions are extractive. States tend to be dysfunctional in poor countries because states are used as a way of organizing power and authority. And obviously, narrowly based political power is not given away usually for a good reason. In the case of South Africa, why was it South Africa became much more democratic in 1994? That was not because white people woke up one day and said, oh my God, this is terrible. We've been discriminating against all these black people. It's shocking. We've got to do something about it. They gave away political power because they were forced to, and because the whole white society in South Africa became kind of unsustainable because of international pressure, because of domestic mobilization by black people. So we emphasize a lot conflict. There's a lot of conflict over institutions, and typically transition from extractive to inclusive institutions involves a lot of conflict. So this is a theory of the world where poor countries are poor, but there's a lot of people who have interest in that system. In North Korea, there's a kind of personalized dictatorship of the Communist Party, but it's very personalized as well, which has a big interest in that system and can't see how it could be running a different type of society. And that's true in most poor countries as well. So there's a lot of interests in it, and that's the thing which makes transition from extractive to inclusive a kind of difficult problem to solve, because it's fundamentally a political problem, not an economic problem. It's not a matter of hiring better economists from the University of Chicago or Harvard University to come up with some clever solution. There's fundamental kind of political conflicts in society that have to be resolved or overcome in order to reorganize the economy to make it more prosperous.
How do you kind of go from, if you have extractive, both political and economic institutions, and then I get the sense you can't just do it stepwise. You can't start with the political institutions becoming inclusive and then economic just follow suit. I mean, presumably it has to happen kind of simultaneously, right? You're not going to, once you you're going to change some institutions, and then maybe you bring in foreign investment, or there's domestic innovation, and then you start to change other institutions. It's kind of like there's a feedback loop, or is it just everything happens at once politically, and then the economics follows?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure anything happens that quickly, but I think that we emphasize very much, this idea that if you can move to more inclusive political institutions, then the economy will tend to naturally sort itself out. So you could imagine that there's feedback from the economy to political institutions, but I guess our academic research has always led us to be very skeptical about that. So, for example, one of the reasons we emphasize that, in the bottom left cell of the matrix, where you move to a more inclusive economy, but politics stays extractive, you could sort of say, well, moving to an inclusive economy, doesn't that naturally tend to sort of push more political inclusion? But I don't think that's actually true in the data. So that's something like, what political scientists call the modernization hypothesis, this idea that economic development tends to promote, democracy, or it tends to promote political inclusion. But that's actually not true in the data. If we did a lot of research on this, that if you look, in the post-war period or even the longer period of time, there's no tendency for countries which grow faster to become more democratic. If you just plot the data, it's just a cloud. So we're very skeptical about this idea of sort of modernization. We don't think there's any natural tendency for economic development on its own to promote political inclusion. So that's why I guess we don't emphasize the feedback that you're talking about, and why we emphasize that, this political dynamics. I mean, what we do emphasize a lot is, that political change, what looks like political change, doesn't necessarily lead to a more inclusive political society. So we use this terminology from sociology we call the iron law of oligarchy, which is this idea of sort of, that there may be political change, but political change is usually just kind of one elite replacing another elite. Think about Egypt. Think about the Arab Spring in Egypt. What did that do? And nothing. It just sort of led to a kind of rotation of elites, but the whole system basically stayed the same. So think about Latin America. In Latin America, it's like the continent of revolutions, but revolutions, just tend to rotate who's running the country rather than lead to sort of fundamental institutional change. So we emphasize a lot, so we talk a lot about that type of change and what sort of things precipitate real change to more inclusive political institutions, but we don't emphasize the feedback you're discussing for that reason.
Are there examples of countries that have escaped from the lower right? And also, is a country always the right level of generality? Is it sometimes a smaller portion of a country or a larger region?
Yeah, so that's a good point. So the country may not necessarily be the right focus at all. So in the book we talk about lots of different sub-regional cases. Like in the US, for example. I mean, there's a huge variation in the US. Think about the US South. So we talk about the US South, and why was it the US South was much poorer historically than the rest of the country? Why did it stay poor until the 1950s? And that's because of extractive institutions, and then those extractive institutions kind of disintegrated. But probably thinking about subnational variation is very important for thinking about how stuff changes, because often you can imagine that some stuff changes. Like if you think about Brazil in some sense, parts of Brazil changed a lot, at a very local level, like Porto Alegre, and then those things sort of scaled up to a national level, and people took, the model that worked in Porto Alegre, and then they tried to expand it in other places. So I think thinking about subnational variation is sort of interesting kind of intellectually, but also maybe in understanding transitions it's important, because sometimes things start in a much smaller way and then they spread, through learning or some sort of diffusion. So I think you're right about the country. The country is not necessarily the right level to look at. And in the book, we certainly talk about lots of examples of subnational variation. And, it's just that a lot of the debate in economics tends to take place at this sort of national level, and even though, but both things are interesting, yeah.
So considering China for a second, you mentioned how there's this economic inclusiveness with political, what was it? Extractiveness. Yeah. So that makes sense. Like you have these entrepreneurs who have made large companies, made huge fortunes, and then you have journalists who get prosecuted for commenting on the stock market or something like that. So it seems like you have innovation in sort of like the private sector, like building companies, whereas there's kind of like this sort of stagnation imposed by the government and like the idea, I guess, like more sort of like.
Yeah.
So to what extent do you think that innovation in one of those areas is dependent on the other? Like if one is being suppressed, whereas one seems like performing better, I guess. Yeah.
I mean, I would say, China's been so successful because it's able to borrow, or appropriate ideas and technologies which were created somewhere else. In the 1970s, it was just extremely backward, and it's been very successful by just borrowing all of these things. It's much more difficult to actually create innovation yourself than to borrow it from somewhere else. So I guess I would say, this impulse of the Communist Party to sort of suffocate, anything that looks vaguely threatening to it politically is sort of fundamentally inconsistent with having a kind of innovation in society. I guess that would be my perspective. So, they're much more interested in keeping control, so information is dangerous and people talking is dangerous and whatever, and you want to suppress that. I don't see how that's consistent with having an innovative society. So I think the model they have only works at some point. I mean, China is so large. It's easy to sort of sit there and think, no, that can't be right. Because it's so large. And it's just so impressive. But in the book we use the example of the Soviet Union. There's some people here are probably as old as I am. But when I was an undergraduate in England, we learnt that the one really big economic success story of the century was the Soviet Union. If you wanted to have rapid economic growth, I'm serious, this is the early 1980s, I'm serious. If you want to have rapid economic growth, you have to have an economy organized like the Soviet Union. Now, you're a young guy, so you'd sort of laugh at that idea now, but it was actually enshrined in every economics textbook up until the late 1980s. In fact, they used to have, in Paul Samuelson's economic textbook, there was a graph showing when the Soviet Union was going to overtake the US in terms of GDP per capita. It started in like the late 1950s, and then when they rewrote the book, every subsequent edition, it would move like 5 years to the right. So it was like 1975, then it was 80, then it was 85, then it was 90, and then that graph disappeared from the book, and then 10 years later it came back with the Soviet Union replaced by China. So I think there's lots of differences between China and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union never, got to export, and exporting is a good, constraint on quality and things like that. So the Chinese have done stuff that the Soviets didn't manage to do. But it's worth, reminding ourselves that for 40 years everyone was completely convinced that the Soviet Union had this wonderful model of economic development and success, and everyone was convinced. The CIA were convinced. The Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership was convinced. So we use that example not because it looks just like China, but just to say, as a kind of reality check on, gosh, China is so big and it's been growing so rapidly, and so this theory can't be right. Of course, the theory, at this level is way too vague and imprecise to actually make some sort of prediction about. I wouldn't be stupid enough to make some prediction about when things will go wrong in China. And I think, if you think about the Arab Spring, it's terribly difficult to predict when these things will collapse. When I was a graduate student, I had all these friends who were Sovietologists, who were sort of in their late 20s, who were planning a long academic career studying the Soviet Union, and then suddenly the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore. So these things academics are very bad at predicting stuff like that. So it's, But I would. That's my point about innovation. It just seems to me you just have, you have this. The thing that the Communist Party are really interested in is keeping power, and eventually that's going to run into. It's going to run into this. What you need to do to have economic prosperity, and I think this issue of innovation is that's the sort of crux of it. So I don't know what's going to happen. Whether China will just sort of converge to some level of income per capita and sort of stay there. But that's beyond my.
I'd also like to ask about China, but not China today, but ancient China, because I believe that up until the Industrial Revolution, China, one might say, is the technologically most advanced place in the world. And the innovation also didn't come from somewhere else, right? But at the same time, China has always been a place a place with an emperor. It's not a democratic system since, I don't know, like maybe 4,000 years ago, and so there seems to be a disagreement there as well. And I wonder, how does that fit into your theory?
Yeah, so I mean, I do think, one thing that's interesting about China is, and one reason why China is able to do what it does is that they are, they are able to tap into this very long history of centralized authority in China. I work, as I say, I work in the DRC a lot, and I got to know the Prime Minister in the DRC, and he keeps on asking me, like, what about the Chinese model? Couldn't we be using the Chinese model in the DRC? And then I said, why don't you just get the people from the Chinese embassy to come and tell you what that model is? And he says, oh, they won't, they just want to do business. They won't talk about ideas. But you tell me, And I said, like, well, here's what they did in 1978 in the rural sector. They reorganized property rights. They did all of this stuff. If you wanted to do that in Congo, could you do that? He said, no. Of course, how could we do that? We don't have that. No one would, we could pass a law, but no one would do anything. So, like, there's this element, in China that there is this history of state centralization, a kind of system of authority, bureaucracy, that can actually kind of move society in a particular way if it wants to. But I think the example you give, shows the limitation of this model, which is that, the consensus amongst historians, as I understand it, is that the reason that all this innovation went into reverse after the Song period in China is because the state decided it was too destabilizing. They banned interoceanic shipping. There was a kind of regress in favor of stability rather than innovation. So, I mean, there's historians who disagree with that, but, one of the standard explanations for why China, was so technologically advanced but then went into reverse is that the state turned against innovation, and it turned against mercantile trade and other things. It moved everybody from the coast. It preferred political stability rather than having a more innovative society. So that example would be kind of consistent with this idea that the same thing is going to happen. But I do think, it's interesting, one of the, why is it that you have all this kind of economic development in East Asia, you don't see in sub-Saharan Africa or other parts of the world? I think that does have a lot to do with the nature of the state, that, South Korea had a history, again, of bureaucracy and state authority that allows it to do stuff that you could never achieve in, like, the Congo or some African country.
Which would you say has a better track record among developing nations, democracy or authoritarian government? Because there are plenty of examples of young democracies that do poorly and authoritarian governments like Singapore, China, Russia for the last 10 years that have led to substantial growth.
Well, what the data says is that, on average, democracies grow faster than, in the post-war period, democracies, on average, grow faster than dictatorships. So that's what the data says. You could say there's, like, lots of heterogeneity in the data, meaning there's some sorts of dictatorships that do better than democracies, or some types of democracies. But I think Russia is doing well because it has lots of natural resources. I don't think that's any other reason why Russia is doing well. I think there are these examples from East Asia of successful so-called developmental dictatorship. But, I think that has a lot to do with what I'm talking about. If you look at Africa, for example, and you say, what's the parts of Africa that are doing well today? That's Rwanda. Why is that? Because Rwanda is, it's more or less the one country in sub-Saharan Africa where a very bureaucratized pre-colonial state kind of emerged as a post-colonial nation. So if you've been to Rwanda, anyone's been here to Rwanda, people obey the rules in Rwanda. People don't cross, except when the little person is green. And, it's not like a normal African country. It's a place where, with a lot of centralized authority, and it has been for a long time. So that, to me, is like an East Asian country that the government in Rwanda is able to tap into this history of political centralization and authority, which is part of what you need to have economic development. But they don't have the other part. they don't have the pluralistic part. They don't have, it's a very militarized, autocratic version of development. So I would say, that's not a sustainable model of development. So I think if you look in the data, you can find examples of dictatorships, or that do well economically, at least for some periods, and that's because they're in places where you have some history of centralization of authority. But, what I'm saying here is that's not a sustainable model. I mean, the Singaporean case is, that's a very anomalous case. Most dictatorships don't look like Singapore. Why emphasize Singapore? Why not emphasize the Philippines? Or why not emphasize Japan? Japan was really economically successful after the Second World War, but it became much more inclusive. So, there's a lot of heterogeneity even within East Asia. And I would say, the balance of the evidence suggests that in some circumstances you can have rapid growth under kind of dictatorial regimes, but it's in very specific circumstances and it doesn't last. Well, in the Singaporean case it did, but that's constructing a theory from the error term, it seems to me. So
many of the institutions you talked about as being important for the economic or the inclusivity in the United States seem to be weakening. Like, it's very expensive now to participate in the patent system, both to file and to defend. The government doesn't seem to get involved in defending patents very much. Microsoft wasn't. There were no penalties imposed on Microsoft for acting in a monopolistic fashion, and you have other monopolies like broadband monopolies that remain well protected.
Yeah.
Is there much research on societies that transition from an inclusive to an extractive state?
Yeah, so I mean, we talk a little bit about that historically in the book. I mean, we give this example of Venice. Venice Venice was probably the most prosperous part. Maybe it wasn't as innovative as China, but at least it was the most prosperous part of Europe in the Middle Ages. And then Venice became this sort of economic backwater, exactly because its institutions, basically it lost all this inclusiveness, and it put it all into reverse. So I think in the book we emphasize, in any inclusive society, there's always incentives to make stuff more extractive. If you can get away with it, there's always going to be incentives for people to do that, set up monopolies, to kind of make connections with politicians. And that's what Rockefeller and Vanderbilt and all these characters were trying to do. But we just emphasize there's sort of feedback in any, in an inclusive society, there's feedback which tends to stop that. I think, in the US, there's a lot of concern about, whether things are working much less well than they used to in the past. There's very interesting research at the moment, actually, by some guys at Michigan about big kind of investment funds. That investment funds buy up shares in lots of different. And there's a study of investment funds like BlackRock, who bought up like lots of airline companies, showing that basically when they started investing in multiple airlines, the airline prices all went up because they could sort of coordinate collusion between the airlines. So, I don't know how big, in the world that is. I usually find myself sort of very difficult. It's very difficult for me to kind of talk about questions like, I think these are really legitimate questions. I find it difficult for me to talk about it because I spend most of my time working in Africa and Colombia and places like that. And if you've been in Congo for a summer and you come back to the United States, you just think everything is just so functional here, that it's very difficult for me to be objective about the challenges that, that people face in the US. So I don't want to belittle them. And there's also, Raj Chetty, my former colleague at Harvard who's just moved to Stanford, has been looking at this question of, the social background of patentees today. So let's look at who takes out patents today and, how rich were, where did they come from? What was their social background? Et cetera, et cetera. So that's a very interesting project to try to revisit this more historical work in the US and ask the question, is that, with all these problems about patents and stuff now that you're alluding to, if we ask the same question today in the US, does it look like historically, or has something really changed in a more sort of oligarchic way? So I don't really know what the findings of that research is, but again, if you saw something very different, you'd be concerned. But I guess the big picture I see is, I still see, if you talk to Harvard undergraduates, I don't know about Chicago undergraduates, probably like Chicago undergraduates want to be like Schopenhauer or Heidegger or somebody, but Harvard undergraduates, they all want to be innovators. They want to do some startup. They want to, there's still very much this focus on, innovation and creativity, and so that seems to be a good sign, I think.
Thanks, and thanks for the talk and the nice Q&A. I'm wondering, I work on international product analytics myself. With our team, we try to understand countries, their development potential, and how we can help countries to develop on a technological front. How would you measure the political situation in a country and the political setting? How would you recommend to do that? And what I want to say is that, like our offer is that it seems to be relatively easy to read economic data. And then, you have all these numbers and you have percentages, but it seems to be much more difficult to read the political element here. And if I was to answer, just to put us into a simple situation, if I was to answer which country is more extractive, India or Indonesia, how would you find an answer to that?
Well, I think you have to weigh different things. I mean, so if you're going to be more practical, and if you're going to talk about a particular country, then you have to weight different things. In not just in terms of like how democratic you are, but what's the quality of democracy and how does democracy kind of work? That seems to be incredibly important. You can get some political science data set, and they'll say, all these countries are listed as democracy, but democracy works in very different ways in different countries, and it puts much more or much less pressure. There's much more accountability in some contexts, or there's much more emphasis on public good provision, or there could be, much more vote buying or much more clientelism. So you need to look at, I guess, the quality of, we emphasize here this issue of, how political power is distributed in society. But if you look at democracy, it's not just about democracy versus dictatorship. There's massively varying quality of democracy. Even dictatorships sort of vary a lot. But I guess I would also emphasize a lot these issues like the state capacity. The capacity of the state. So India, India does have at least this tradition at the top of immense kind of bureaucratic capacity and, bureaucratic sort of course, at the bottom, it can be very different. But it does have, so I guess you'd have to sort of pull apart the state and the strengths and weaknesses of the state and, the strengths and weaknesses of the democratic system and how those two things sort of interact. I mean, there are databases, there's databases on, the effectiveness of the state or how bureaucratized the state is. I don't know how well they capture any particular case. But I get, the devil, I guess, is in the details of these two dimensions and how they sort of fit together. The Indonesian case is an interesting case also where, there was a period of kind of desire to sort of promote development, and they brought in capacity from Berkeley, if I remember correctly, the Berkeley boys. They had the Berkeley boys in Indonesia, where there wasn't really democracy, but there was a kind of impulse coming from the top to sort of push development. But again, that wasn't a very sustainable model. It turned out, but now they have a different, they have a much more open political system now. But I guess anyway, that's. Yeah, there's some. There is work on that, but you're right that it's very little compared to what goes into economic indicators, and it's not a sexy activity in academia either. You're sort of creating this massive public good, and which everyone is free riding off, and so it's difficult to kind of get people. It's difficult to get people to fund that, and it's difficult to get people to put a lot of effort into it. I mean, people asked us. I should say, I'm equally to blame. People asked us, you should put together some indices of how inclusive and how extractive countries are. And I guess we're nervous, about doing that. But maybe there's no professional return to doing it either. I don't know, sort of thinking, why we haven't done it. I guess we haven't done it because we're not, with Daron, we're not in the business of sort of selling some product, Daron and I. We're just sort of, we're academic scribblers, and as John Maynard Keynes said. So, we're not in. I'm not interested in running around the world consulting. So maybe, I'm worried that if we look like we have a product, people will want us to start providing it, and that's kind of not what we do really. But I understand the point that it would be much better to have thinking about the state and the way the state works, there's precious little comparative evidence on stuff like that. There's some attempts by sociologists to do it, but there's a paucity of data on that. I agree. Yeah.
I've got this. I'm visiting here. I'm visiting from Papua New Guinea, where my wife is working in development work. Mm-hmm. And that's perhaps too complex and distant from your own experience. But there are a couple of countries close to where you've worked in Africa, and I'm thinking of Zambia, and I'm thinking of Botswana.
Uh-huh.
And I'm just wondering if you feel you know enough about those countries to use them as examples about how to go from what is more inclusive now politically in both to something which is less poor. Zambia in particular is very deeply, deeply poor.
Yeah.
And it's one of the great challenges of development in that country is to try to develop policies that will lift more than an elite out of that deep poverty.
Yeah. I don't know that much about Zambia, but I know a lot about Botswana, actually. I did a lot of research in Botswana. We talk about Botswana in the book, about why is Botswana different, and why has Botswana been so successful. And I think that has a lot to do with historical differences in, like Rwanda. The Botswana is not a place historically, in the 19th century before colonialism came. It didn't have one kind of centralized uniform political system, but it had a group of political systems, these Swana tribes, that had the same types of institutions. They were all culturally and historically related to each other, and they had centralized authority. They had bureaucracy. They had accountability also. Botswana is very interesting. Botswana hasn't just been successful since 1965. It was very successful in the 19th century also. So they had a long period of innovation. They understood that the whites were coming and this was a problem, and they needed to start innovating and changing in order to cope with that. So I think the story in Botswana is it's a very interesting story of they had these historical institutions which had elements of sort of centralization, of accountability, and they sort of modernized those. So if you go to Gaborone, you can go in Gaborone. When they built Gaborone, they built it from scratch at the time just before independence, because they were ruled. The British ruled them from South Africa, from Mafeking and Vryburg. What they did was they built this new city, but they sort of incorporated all the traditional elements into the city. So they took these hotlas, these traditional meeting places, and they built hotlas in the Gaborone, and they're still doing it now. I was just there last November, actually. And so they kind of modernized tradition at the same time as sort of preserving it. But I think those traditional institutions they created a lot of accountability on these post-independent politicians in Botswana. If you read Seretse Khama, who was the first president, his biography, he'd go around the country like justifying his policies and explaining why they were doing stuff. I mean, what African president did that, after independence? They might have gone around throwing money out of the window of their car or something like Mobutu used to do. But trying to sort of get people on board and try to create some consensus about what they were going to do, I think that's very much because of the way authority worked in traditional Swana society. But I think what's interesting about it is the way they sort of modernized this tradition. They sort of kept the best bits of it. How were they able to do that? Well, it didn't get screwed up by British colonialism, for one thing. British colonialism messed up lots of similar types of institutions all over, like amongst the Barotse, for example, who had very similar types of institutions. Even Lesotho, who were ethnically related to the Swana. They screwed up. Lesotho just got screwed up by becoming, can I say that on camera? By becoming a sort of labor recruiting ground for the mines in Johannesburg. So I think, colonialism distorted a lot of these things. But, I think that's the story of Botswana. I was recently in Abu Dhabi. And it's interesting, in Abu Dhabi, they're trying to do the same thing. They're trying to sort of modernize tradition. They had this traditional organization of the sort of sheikhdom and all these tribes and etc. And they've taken that and they tried to map it onto a modern state, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. So the tribes get ministries now, So instead of just getting handouts from the sheikh, they've recreated the system and I just God, I don't know if it's going to work, but it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, it's not so different. I mean, the details are different, of course, but at some level, the spirit of it is quite similar to what they did in in Botswana. Of course, there's much less accountability, I think, in the traditional state in Abu Dhabi, but than there was in Botswana. But anyway, so I think that sounds like a very idiosyncratic story about why Botswana did well. How they managed to build inclusive institutions, how they managed to build. That has a lot to do with having an effective state. Also, there's a lot of inequality, and there's a sort of, if you've been to Botswana, it's a very kind of, there's a level, it's a quite oligarchic place. There's a lot of hierarchy, and there's a lot of deference, towards kind of elites in Botswana. So I think there's still a sort of element of, there's an element of these inclusive institutions that quite maybe is not there, and maybe that's one reason why Botswana it's done very well. It has a state, it takes natural resources, it uses the natural resources to provide public goods, and there's enough accountability to make that work. But there's other elements of inclusion that don't work very well. Chile is like that. I always say Botswana is very much like Chile. Chile has this state, has a long history of state centralization, has a state which is able to take the natural resource wealth and use it to provide public goods and build roads and stuff like that. But also Chile is like a ridiculously oligarchic society. If you go to Santiago, everyone is married to everybody else. They went to 4 Catholic boys' schools. And there's a sort of enormous impediment to kind of broader inclusion. There's enough accountability so that the system works and the money doesn't get stolen and public goods get provided. But there's a big barrier to going to the next level, of really kind of not becoming a Latin American country, but becoming something different. That's very hard because it's so oligarchic. I think Botswana is sort of a bit like that too, But Zambia, I don't know so much about Zambia. That story about Botswana, it sounds very idiosyncratic, and I think the world is a bit like that, though. I think that there's many different paths to inclusive institutions and extractive institutions. If you think historically, it's difficult to sort of say there's some well-defined basin of attraction, where if you're here, then you're going to become inclusive. If you're there, you're going to become extractive. Somehow there's a lot of idiosyncratic ways that countries built inclusive institutions. How Botswana did it looks very different from the way Britain did it historically, or Sweden for that matter, or even the US, So
Let's thank Professor Robinson for a great talk.